Hello, I'm Robert, and fact-checking to help you if you're scared of many things. And this time, it's people who are, apparently there are lots of people panicking because they believe that the Supreme Court has made it impossible for Biden to regulate carbon dioxide in the United States. This is utter nonsense. It's a ruling on the now repealed Obama Clean Power Act, which Biden never planned to use. So it's rather bizarre, well, surprising that they decide to take on the case. It's rare for the Supreme Court to take on a case about something that's been repealed. They must have thought it was an important principle to look at. So now, what did they actually do? Well, it is lots of people are claiming completely falsely that this is the first time the Supreme Court has ever done something like that. Like this, it's not. What they were looking at is at what's the limit of how major a major enforcement the EPA can do without independent authorization from Congress. So it's sometimes called the major questions doctrine. So it's the previous Supreme Courts have ruled on this at least 6 times before. And I gave one example. In 1995, the FDA restricted the sale of tobacco to children because of the effects of smoking on health, which were very clear and serious. The Supreme Court, it was taken to the Supreme Court by a tobacco company, and the Supreme Court agreed that the FDA's findings that tobacco is serious and harmful to children, but what they said is that this clearly has a big impact on tobacco companies, and according to the reading of the law, the law that empowered FDA to act on drugs and medicines and food, and then looking at the past history of decisions involving tobacco under that law. For instance, the Congress at various times ruled on various things to do with tobacco, which made it clear that it was Congress had to make these decisions, not the FDA. Based on that long, complicated examination of the history, they said that it's very clear that Congress has not delegated the authority to the FDA to regulate tobacco. So that was their final decision. So the FDA had to stop regulating sales of tobacco to kids, regulating commercial sales of tobacco. A long, complicated argument, but that was their conclusion. And they based it on the major question doctrine. If the FDA had done a small amount of regulation of the sales of tobacco, if it hadn't impacted much on tobacco manufacturers, then it would have been acceptable. But it had such a major impact that this is something using the major questions doctrine. This is a kind of informal doctrine that the Supreme Court uses to rule on the range of powers of the executive. This has to be authorized by Congress. So this went back to Congress, and in 2007 Congress explicitly gave the FDA the authority to regulate sales of tobacco. And so then the FDA could then do what it had been doing before the ruling in 2000. So that's an example of the major questions doctrine. In a very similar way, the Supreme Court has ruled, so the Obama Clean Power Act used the Clean Air Act, a different bill from the one that was used for the FDA, but this Clean Power Act, they used this Clean Power Act to set a cap on CO2, which was explicitly designed to push coal-fired power stations out of business over the following decade. It was meant to, it was designed to. They worked out what percentage of coal-fired power stations should we have a decade from now. And based on that, they would set a cap of CO2 in order to force them to close, and and force the utility companies to transition to renewables. And the Supreme Court. So this is the one that the decision they ruled on just now, and this was it never really came properly into effect. The Trump repealed it. Biden decided he didn't want to do it that way, so it has no effect on anything they're ruling. But they ruled that this was a major questions doctrine, just like with the FDA and tobacco, and that if Congress wanted the EPA to be able to use their powers on carbon dioxide to close down the entire industry in this way, then they needed to put it into legislation. That the Clean Power Act had just one small section, and it just didn't, according to the Supreme Court, give the EPA that level of authority. It wasn't a very controversial decision, really. It was kind of pretty much expected. It wouldn't, you would have been a little bit surprised if they said it was permitted. Although, of course, Obama thought it was. It was a kind of borderline. It was. Well, obviously, it had to be. It argued both ways in the lower courts. But that's the way that a decision gets to the Supreme Court. One lower court argues it one way. It goes to appeal. The appeal court goes the other way, and then the original whatever you call it will then say we don't like that appeal decision, and they will go to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court then can say we're not going to get involved, and then the appeal stands. Or the Supreme Court can say, well, that looks like a tricky bit of legislation. We will have a closer look at it for you, and that's how a legal decision gets to the Supreme Court. So obviously, two lower courts that is argued in opposite directions on this one, and I think that I haven't checked up this one in detail, but that's the normal way that it's done. So anyway, so that's so this one. So this does have an implication to Biden, but remember, well, Biden has done lots of executive orders, such as mandating that the executive fleet of cars all transition to electric vehicles, and that is not seen as, that's not been challenged. None of his executive orders has explicitly been challenged and sent to the Supreme Court, as far as I know, on clean energy. At any rate, this has no implications for any of them. At least I checked the articles, I checked people writing about this. Nobody came up with even a single executive order or single executive decision that Biden had done, or executive plan that is affected by this ruling. The ruling would only make a difference to executives. It's only about the extent of the power of the executive. It makes no difference to the legislature. And so Biden's big climate plan that he is putting through Congress, he wants to do with Joe Manchin and Bernie Sanders both have to agree on that, then that is in legislation. So the implication of this for Biden's legislation is just that he has to be very careful to make sure that if the legislation is requiring an executive branch like the EPA or some other executive branch to do something major, then it has to explicitly give them the authority to do it. Just say directly in it that EPA. So if Biden wanted to do it this way and he doesn't, he would just write in. They would just write in the law that the EPA is permitted to set a carbon cap for the industry, and the EPA is permitted to choose that cap in such a way that coal power plants have to go out of business. They would just need to write that into the law, and then it would be legal to do that. And then EPA would go ahead and do it. But he's not going to do that. And he's, especially with Joe Manchin, he's being very careful that the coal coal industry can transition. They can try to use carbon capture and storage. They have the ability to explore that, to try and reduce carbon in that ways, and it's very much a carrot and no stick approach of encouraging the ones that succeed in reducing CO2 emissions. So it's quite coal friendly as far as coal friendly can go, given that Joe Manchin also agrees, they all agree, that coal powered power plants have to be phased out. But they can be phased out in a very fast way or in a gradual, slow way. They can be phased out in a way that's economically easier for the coal power plants, and they're focusing on making sure that the transition is an easy one for the coal industry. The coal industry will eventually have no coal power plants left, but it will happen in a way that is easy for people like Joe Manchin, who's a major shareholder in the coal industry. So it's not the first decision like this. There are at least 6 previous cases that I explained, and it's about limits to the executive. It will limit future Republican presidents too. There's nothing particularly Democrat about this decision, although it was majority of Conservative justices. But remember, Conservative does not mean Republican. Conservative generally means originalist. They go by the original meaning of the text. Can tend to be very niggly and about the meanings of the words. It's not surprising they'd be more towards this kind of thing. And Republicans like them because the original meaning of the text often is more closer to conservative values, which are related to the way Americans used to think, as somewhat less changed than the way Democrat ideas have changed. So that's why Republicans tend to like originalist justices, but the justices are not thinking like Republicans. It could easily be that some of those 5 conservative justices vote Democrat every year. There would be no contradiction in that. Or that one of the 3 liberal justices votes Republican every year. It's entirely possible because they're not related. And so they decide the EPA. There's no question at all that the EPA can regulate CO2 emissions. CO2 does count as a pollutant. It wasn't in the original. I don't think it was in the original bill, but EPA has the authority to find new pollutants. It was absolutely okay for EPA to say that CO2 is a pollutant. We have to regulate new power plants so that they have to be low emissions. There's no question about that. The question was about whether they could use a cap on CO2 to force existing coal power plants to go out of business, to force utilities to not build coal power plants, and it was mainly about forcing them out of business was the main thing. Like this is say that will force a nationwide transition away from the use of coal to generate electricity. So they said that may be a sensible solution to the crisis of the day, but it's not plausible that Congress gave EPA that authority to adopt on its own such a regulatory scheme. So it's the EPA doing it on its own that was the issue. It wasn't the Congress, was not the issue. It was EPA doing it, or it wasn't EPA doing it, wasn't the issue. EPA doing it on its own under executive direction by the President, indeed, but he's still the executive branch. It needed the Congress to do it. So it's not a restriction on what Congress can do. He doesn't say that it's unconstitutional. So they'll need to be a bit more careful. Now, Joe Manchin, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the climate bill. So Joe Manchin had more or less got the climate bill sorted out before Biden went to COP26. It was ready to go. If they had only got the climate bill and nothing else, they would have been able to pass it immediately after COP26. But the problem was with some of the other matters of legislation, particularly taxation and things to do with support of can't remember, it was to do with support of people with illnesses or something. I can't remember the details, but there were certain things that were absolutely nothing to do with climate change that were why they got stuck. And Biden put it rather amusingly that with the situation as it is now, with reconciliation you need 50 votes to support it, and in the situation where there's no support from Republicans, then it's like 51 presidents, because all 50 of those Democrats have to agree to the final bill, and Biden, so that's 51, have to agree before it can go ahead. So it's like not just Biden has to okay it, he can veto anything against a filibuster unless there's 60 votes against in favour of it. But all the others can vote veto it as well, so it's like 51 presidential vetoes. It's basically the Democrat situation, so it's no wonder it's difficult for them to get this bill through, because either Biden or Joe Manchin, not either Bernie Sanders, who's very liberal, or Joe Biden or Joe Manchin, either of them can veto it, and they have equal power to Joe Biden, equal veto power to Joe Biden, in effect, on this reconciliation bill. So that's why it's been so tricky. So what they're doing it now, there was a lot of problem with publicity, that Joe Manchin would say something and Bernie Sanders would say something, and people would get leaked, and it would get the New York Times and Washington Post would say something about it. There'd be lots of speculation, and then that made them very difficult for them to find a meeting point, and they tend to get entrenched in opposite views. So they're deliberately not doing any publicity about it. So this is why you're not hearing anything about it just now. It's not that nothing's happening. And the Democrats, what they have done is that they have left just Joe Manchin and the leader of the Senate, not Kamala Harris, what's his name? Forget his name. You know who it is. But anyway, they're talking. The leader of the Senate and Joe Manchin. If you're in the United States, I'm sure his name. I'm in the United Kingdom. I do know the name, but it's just at the corner of my. I just can't seem to bring it to mind. Anyway, those there are Chuck Schumer. I've got it written down. Joe Manchin and Chuck Schumer. They are the other 49 Democrats have agreed that those two know what they want, their demands are. So those two are talking about it privately. They're working something out together. First of all, Joe Manchin tried to achieve a bipartisan deal involving 10 Republicans. He couldn't find them. There are 7 Republicans in the Climate Caucus, the Climate Solutions Caucus. You need 10 to get it through filibuster. And he just couldn't get enough Republican climate approvals to get a filibuster-proof legislation that way. So he's gone back to working with the Democrats on their own. Because if you can't get 10, then there's no point in even trying with the Republicans, because it means the Democrats can just do whatever they want. Because I think the extra 7 Republicans will just make it even more complicated to negotiate without achieving anything. So he's gone back to doing it as a Democrat-only bill, and so those two are working it out together. Once they are finished, and the rest of the Democrats don't know what they've decided, so once they are finished, they will then show it to the rest of the Democrats. They will then probably need a bit more discussion and working out and arguing to, some people, there might be some issues with it at that stage, and they hope to hammer it all out and finish it by the end of July, ready for the August recess. If it gets all the way through to September, it's getting rather close to the November midterms, so they're hoping at least to have a vote on it. I think they're hoping for a vote before the end of July. So that's the date to look out for. End of July, hopefully we will hear some movement, we probably won't get much in the way of news before then. And so now, that's just the sheep going past my window. They do it many times a day. So then the other thing is that the United States is actually, it does actually have reducing emissions already. You can see it's been falling since about 2005 or so. That dip is because of COVID. China is the biggest emitter. The United States is about half and falling. China is increasing. So China is the top priority for this decade. And if you look at the United States, it's like Europe, lots and lots of small countries really, with many different ideas. The black numbers there show the date that these states aim to reach zero emissions electricity. So obviously you really want zero emissions electricity much earlier than those numbers, but it's a start. And that's 60% of the power companies want zero by 2050, where you got this in place. Now, the blue numbers show the actual plan to reach total zero emissions of the entire economy. So there are 5 US states, mainly executive orders. Massachusetts, it's legislation. And is it, Maryland, it's legislation. Yeah, Maryland's legislation, not Massachusetts. Maryland has it in legislation, zero emissions by 2045. California, it's just executive orders, but they are very serious about it. And they've not quite managed to pass some bills through, but they're certainly doing a lot. And they have another tranche of bills that are going through right now, which passed the Senate. And if they pass the House, then they will be the first kind of really, but it's not the first. The first thing is a zero. They've got legislation about cars, I think, and legislation about electricity, but they've got a much longer, much larger scale legislation going through right now. So California is well headed for its 2045 zero emissions. They're on the legislative path. If not this, then sometime in the next few months or year or so, they likely will be on really substantial legislation for zero emissions by 2045. And California, if it was a separate country, would be the 5th or 6th economy in the world by GDP. So the United States is doing a lot. So even if Biden's doesn't manage to pass this legislation before the midterms, and then in the midterms, if he gets 2 extra seats, if he gets even 1 extra seat, then he can decide in legislation, do I legislate for more like Joe Manchin or more like Bernie Sanders? So he's got much more flexibility just with 1 more seat. And with 2 extra seats, then he could do legislation that neither of those will fully approve. So he's got just a few extra seats. If the Democrats win a few extra seats in the midterms, then the climate legislation gets much, much more flexible, assuming they also retain the House. So it all rather depends on what happens in the midterms. And but the law being overturned by the Supreme Court is actually giving the Democrats a bit of an edge there. So anyway, we'll see what happens. It's also possible that the Republicans vote in more climate-friendly Democrats. I'm not sure. I think a lot of them are Trump loyalists. I'm not sure if they're going to add to the climate-friendly Republicans in the midterms. So, anything else I need to talk about? I talk about that, not the first use of the major questions doctrine. Yeah, so just the thing. So we often get loads and loads of people freaking out. If you're a very social kind of person, then it's a natural social thing to be influenced by people freaking out and think they must be onto something. And they often aren't. You often get like crowd hysteria. Like, you know, when a crowd panics, but there's nothing actually scary. So, or a group of people panic and they all start panicking and there's nothing to be scared of. So these people, as I've explained, this bill, so it's all triggered by some sensationalist blog posts and sensationalist stories, and some stories by the mainstream press that don't explain it very well, and the clickbait, even the respectful media do clickbait headlines, and you have to read very carefully, and they will interview scholars with rather extreme views and not explain that they're a minority and an unusual view and things like that. So even the mainstream do that sort of thing in order to get an exciting story. They tend to hype things up a bit, and certainly sensationalist press do. And when you get people freaking out, so, and then you get journalists who just don't research very carefully, and especially in other countries like in the United Kingdom, they don't know a lot about it. They don't know this. A journalist in the United Kingdom set to cover this story, and he's only got an hour or two to research on it. He's probably not going to find out about the major questions doctrine in the process of writing his article. So, unless they interview experts on the topic. So, the stories you get in the mainstream press are not always very well researched either. Especially things like the law, which is incredibly intricate and sometimes difficult to understand. And remember that in other countries they don't have, the United Kingdom has nothing even remotely resembling the US Supreme Court. Our Supreme Court in the United Kingdom, nobody knows any of their cases by name. They rarely do anything that has any impact on the government in any way, or in the way that legislation is interpreted in any way that anyone notices. So a journalist writing in the United Kingdom has such a different perspective. It's very unlikely that they're going to really truly understand unless they are already an expert or they read very carefully and they have hours in which... So because I'm retired, I could spend many hours on this, and that's the only reason why I've been able to do a decent fact check. I probably spent a lot more time on this than your typical journalist would on the topic. And yes, as I explained, it takes several hours for each of these fact checks. With science, then I know the science. With science I have a shortcut that I usually know most of the science already because I follow science very carefully. With these legal cases, I don't know all the background of US law already. I have a good logical mind because I trained in logic, and my postgraduate research was in logic, in the logical foundations of mathematics, which is far more rigorous even than law used by legislators, used by justices. It's extremely intricate and very, very precise. And so that's the main way that I'm able to read these things and get to a decent understanding of it. And but I don't have a good background in law, but I have a good background in logic. And then I check the experts and I read what the experts say, just as with any other fact check. But because things like the major questions doctrine, I didn't even know about the major questions doctrine before I started reading this. So if it was science, then I would immediately know the major questions doctrine because I've got a good understanding of science. I've been following many of the subjects that people are scared about, some of them like climate change since before. It was even before the beginnings of climate science. I've been interested in climate science since the subject began, really, because it only really began in earnest in the 1970s. And some other subjects that scare people I've been interested in since the subject began in science, but it's not the same with law. So anyway, and then that's a lot of people writing about Justice Thomas and other things. I'm going to talk about that separately. Oh yes, then I talk about how you can I'll do a separate video about, yes, but this is just something, I'll do a separate video about the voting situation for, I've done enough for one video. I'll stop at this point. I'm just going to do a taste. I'll do a separate video at some point about how the Democrats actually have a decent chance of still retaining the House and achieving a 2-seat majority, or maybe even more, in the Senate. And so usually the president loses the House in the midterms, but sometimes they retain it. And it's not impossible. This is one of the rare cases where the Democrats retain the House because of two things: the abortion, the Roe decision, and so many people are energized to want to support the Democrats, and because of Trump supporting far-right loyalists, which is good for Trump but bad for the Republican Party in terms of the number of seats they get. And if you look at the if you look at this, then only 71% of Democrats stay loyal to their party between 2016 and 2020, and only 76% of Republicans. So there's actually an awful lot happens in between the two of those. So there's an awful lot of flexibility, far more than you realise, when you see the Democrats seem stable and the Republicans seem stable. There's an awful lot of flip-flopping in between. So there's more flexibility there than people realise. And coming into midterms, it's entirely possible that the Republicans might do that. So some go to Democrat and some go to Independent, but the Democrats stay as Democrat and not do that like they've done in the past. If that happens, if that does happen this midterm, then that's going to make a big edge for the Democrats. So, but we don't know. It could go the other way. But I say I'm saying this for people who I am not. I try to be not go either side of my fact checks, but I'm fact checking this for scared people who are scared of climate change, scared of losing the right to choice on abortion, and worried about LGBT rights. And for the most part, those are Democrats, sometimes Republican. So that's why it may seem it's somewhat pro-Democrat. It's really talking about what these people are scared of and then encouraging them that they don't need to be so scared because the Democrats do. And one of the things that is a positive is, okay, if you worry about all these things, get out and vote. And the Democrats do have a chance, and you can help ensure that the Democrats have, in this case, strong climate legislation after the midterms by making sure they pick up a couple of votes. Then that will strengthen, and it'll mean they have many more capabilities in reconciliation bills in the future, which they're able to do about 2 a year, depending how they do them. Anyway, so that's it. So I'll now stop and upload this, and hopefully this will help some of you who are scared. And I'll do a separate video about that at some point in the near future.